She trembled, saying yes at the altar, but had no idea what was coming. It was on the wedding night that the millionaire confessed his true feelings, changing everything between them. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened next will move you deeply. The silk dress weighed on her shoulders, as if she carried the burden of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Standing before the altar, while the intense fragrance of white roses mixed with the scent of candle wax, Emma felt her hands tremble violently. The word "I do" left her mouth as a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible among the approving murmur of the guests. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine gleamed under the golden light of the New York afternoon. The stained glass windows cast colored patches on the centuries-old marble floor, creating an ephemeral mosaic that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the choir's hymns. 300 guests observed the ceremony with expressions of calculated admiration, faces polished by years of social events, where smiles were measured in carats and tears were saved for more private moments. Emma Richardson, 38 years old, literature professor at Columbia University, doctorate in philosophy with a dissertation on existentialism in the works of T.S. Eliot, stood beside a man she barely knew. A man whose name appeared regularly in the business pages of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. A man who, 6 months ago, had proposed an arrangement that defied everything she believed about herself. Alexander Hayes stood erect beside her, imposing in his three-piece suit tailored on Savile Row. His silver hair, combed back with military precision, framed an angular face, where two eyes the color of aged whiskey observed everything with disconcerting intensity. At 52 years old, he radiated a natural authority that made others lean slightly in his presence, like flowers seeking the sun. The priest pronounced words Emma barely registered. Her mind wandered backward to the rainy October afternoon when it all began, to the moment when desperation had pushed her to consider the unthinkable. The bookstore pages and poetry had been her father's dream. James Richardson, a man with calloused hands and a poet's heart, who had dedicated 40 years of his life to collecting first editions, rare manuscripts and literary treasures that others considered obsolete. When illness began to steal his memory, piece by piece like a puzzle dismantling in reverse, James had entrusted Emma with his most precious legacy. "Take care of it for me, sweetheart," he had said that afternoon, his blue eyes momentarily clear through the fog of Alzheimer's. "It's all I have to leave you, all that I am." She had promised. She had sworn on her mother's grave, who had passed when Emma was barely 12, that she would keep the bookstore alive, but numbers didn't understand promises. Debts accumulated like autumn leaves, each unpaid invoice another nail in the coffin of her hopes. Banks had stopped returning her calls, potential investors withdrew upon seeing the accounting books, and the final deadline, that cruel ultimatum from the bank threatening to execute the mortgage, approached inexorably. That's when he appeared. The door chime had rung with its familiar tinkle that October afternoon. Emma looked up from the counter where she was trying, for the umpteenth time, to make the numbers add up. The man who entered wore a dark cashmere overcoat, raindrops glistening in his hair like tiny diamonds. His Italian leather Oxford shoes left wet footprints on the floor worn down by decades of footsteps. The first thing she noticed were his eyes. There was something in them, a depth that contrasted with the calculated coldness of his posture. He observed the shelves with an attention that surprised her, not the superficial glance of someone entering to take refuge from the rain, but the meticulous examination of a connoisseur. When he picked up a rare copy of Walt Whitman, a first edition of Leaves of Grass from 1855, Emma couldn't contain herself. "That edition has a fascinating history," she said, approaching. "It belonged to the personal collection of Ralph Waldo Emerson. There's a handwritten dedication on the first page." The man looked at her then, truly looked at her, and something changed in the air between them, an invisible electric current that she attributed to the storm outside. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," he quoted, his deep voice resonating in the space crowded with books. Whitman understood that the song of the self is also the song of humanity. We're all connected through words. Emma blinked, momentarily disarmed. She didn't expect erudition from a man with that appearance of implacable executive. Most people associate that poem with individualism, she responded, recovering her composure. But you're right. It's about the interconnection of all souls, the democratic vision of poetry. He smiled then, a small smile that barely curved the corners of his lips, but completely transformed his face, softening the hard lines. Alexander Hayes, he introduced himself, extending a hand, and you must be Emma Richardson. I've heard a lot about this bookstore. That first encounter led to a 2-hour conversation about American literature of the 19th century, about the responsibility of art in times of crisis, about the value of preserving culture in a world obsessed with the ephemeral. When he finally left, leaving behind the Whitman copy along with a business card, Emma found herself thinking about him long after the rain had ceased. The proposal arrived a week later, at a dinner in a discreet restaurant in the Upper East Side. Alexander had been direct, almost clinically efficient in his explanation. "I need a wife," he said, without preamble. "My most traditional investors distrust a man of my age without family commitments. There are rumors, speculation about my personal life that are affecting important businesses. A marriage would resolve that." Emma almost choked on her wine. "Are you proposing a marriage of convenience in the 21st century? I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know about your bookstore's situation. I know the bank will execute the mortgage in 3 months. I can make that disappear. I can save your father's legacy." Emma's heart beat painfully against her ribs. "In exchange for what exactly?" 1 year of marriage, public appearances, social events, the image of a respectable couple. In private, each maintains their own life. At the end of the term, an amicable divorce and generous compensation that will allow you to expand the bookstore as you always dreamed. It's insane. It's business. Alexander leaned back in his chair. "I'm not asking for love, Miss Richardson. I'm only asking that you act as if you could come to care for me, for a year. Then you'll be free." Emma should have said no. Every fiber of her independent being, every principle she had cultivated during years of building herself without anyone's help, screamed at her to reject that absurd proposal. But then she thought of her father, of his lost gaze when she visited the nursing home in Connecticut, of the brief moments of lucidity where he asked about the bookstore with a hope that broke her soul. "I need to think about it," she murmured. "Take a week," he responded, leaving a manila envelope on the table. "Here are the detailed terms. Read them, consider them, and if you decide your pride is worth more than your legacy, I'll understand perfectly." That night, alone in her small apartment in Greenwich Village, Emma read the contract 3 times. It was exhaustive, meticulous, covered every possible contingency, and it was generous, obscenely generous. It wouldn't only save the bookstore, but would turn it into a cultural reference point of New York. Pride, she discovered, had a price, and hers turned out to be lower than she ever would have imagined. Now standing at the altar, with the platinum ring shining on her finger like an elegant shackle, Emma wondered if she had made the right decision. The priest declared them husband and wife. Alexander lifted her veil with surprisingly delicate fingers, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't interpret. The kiss was brief, chaste, appropriate for the occasion. But when his lips brushed hers, Emma felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold of the cathedral. Applause erupted around them, the bells of St. John rang with joy, and as they walked down the central aisle toward a life that neither of them had planned, Emma clung to her new husband's arm and allowed herself, for one fleeting instant, to imagine that all of this could be real. She didn't know then that the truth that would change everything was waiting, lurking in the shadows of that wedding night, ready to demolish every certainty she thought she had. The Connecticut estate rose imposingly against the night sky, its illuminated windows spilling golden light over the perfectly manicured gardens. Emma observed the stone facade as the black Mercedes stopped in front of the main entrance and felt the air leave her lungs. "Welcome home," said Alexander, his voice neutral, professional. Home. The word sounded strange, applied to that 6,000-square-foot construction where she hadn't chosen a single curtain. During the months of fictional courtship, She had visited the property barely twice, always accompanied by the entourage of designers and organizers that Alexander had hired to orchestrate the wedding. She had never felt less at home anywhere. The butler, a middle-aged man named Thomas, whose expression suggested he had seen too much to be surprised by anything, opened the door for them with an impeccable bow. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes," the surname sounded foreign in Emma's ears. "Dinner is served in the small dining room as you requested." Alexander nodded briefly and guided Emma through the marble vestibule. Her heels echoed against the polished floor, each step an echo that amplified the silence between them. The reception had ended barely an hour ago, but seemed to belong to another life. The small dining room turned out to be a room that could have easily accommodated 20 people. An antique mahogany table occupied the center, but only 2 places were set, facing each other, separated by an ocean of gleaming wood and a centerpiece of white orchids. "I thought we'd be hungry," explained Alexander, pulling out the chair for her to sit. The reception was exhausting. Emma let herself fall into the seat, grateful to finally be able to take off her shoes under the table. The wedding dress had been replaced by an elegant champagne-colored silk ensemble that one of the assistants had prepared, but she still felt disguised. "Thank you," she murmured. "I haven't eaten almost anything all day." Nerves had closed her stomach since dawn. Every bite of the wedding banquet had been a battle against nausea. A chef appeared silently to serve them poultry consommé with fine herbs. The warm aroma enveloped Emma, reminding her of the soups her mother prepared on winter nights when the kitchen of the small Brooklyn apartment filled with steam and laughter. They ate in silence for several minutes. Emma studied Alexander over the rim of her wineglass, trying to decipher the man with whom she had just legally united her life. He ate with the same meticulous precision with which he seemed to do everything, every movement calculated, efficient. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Alexander looked up, his whiskey eyes meeting hers. "Of course. Why me?" The question had been burning her throat from the beginning. New York is full of women willing to occupy this position, younger women, more beautiful, more suitable for your world. He left his silverware on the plate with deliberate care. "Do you want the honest answer or the convenient one?" "Always the honest one." A pause. Alexander took his wineglass, swirled the ruby liquid, observing how it caught the candlelight. "Because you're the only person I've met in years who looks at me without calculating how much I'm worth." His words fell like stones in still water. "In my world, everyone wants something. Investments, contacts, favors. You argued with me about T.S. Eliot for half an hour without caring who I was. You treated me as an equal, not as an opportunity." Emma felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "That's not a compliment, it's just basic courtesy." "Exactly." Alexander sketched that small smile she was beginning to recognize. "And that basic courtesy has become extraordinarily rare in my existence." The chef returned to serve the second course, roasted lamb with port wine reduction. The silence extended again, but something had changed in its texture. It was no longer the uncomfortable emptiness of 2 strangers, but something closer to a contemplative pause between 2 people beginning to see each other. "There's something I must show you," said Alexander when they finished dinner. "Follow me." He guided her through hallways decorated with art she recognized from auction catalogues: a small hopper, a Pollock sketch, Warhol prints. Finally, they stopped in front of a solid oak door in the east wing of the mansion. "Your rooms," he announced, opening the door. Emma held back a gasp. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a complete apartment, decorated with a taste that seemed extracted directly from her dreams. The walls were lined with noble wood shelves, each one full of carefully selected books. An antique desk occupied the corner by the window, illuminated by an Art Nouveau-style reading lamp. The bed, wide and covered with ivory linen sheets, faced a balcony overlooking the back garden. But what captured her attention were the books. They weren't generic decoration bought by the meter. Each volume was a first edition, a bibliographic rarity, a treasure she would have recognized anywhere. There was the Moby Dick from 1851 she had dreamed of possessing. There, the complete collection of the Lost Generation in their original editions. There, illuminated medieval manuscripts that should be in museums. How? Her voice broke. I investigated, Alexander responded simply. Your academic articles mention several of these texts as desired objects of study. Your father told me about others during one of my visits. Emma turned abruptly. You visited my father? A flash of something, vulnerability, crossed Alexander's face. Several times. I wanted to ask for your hand, even if symbolically. Hikakin has good days and bad days. On one of the good ones, he spoke to me for hours about you, about the girl who read under the sheets with a flashlight, about the teenager who cried with Emily Dickinson's poems, about the woman who inherited his love for words. Tears began to roll down Emma's cheeks without permission. No one in her entire adult life had done something like this for her. No one had taken the trouble to truly know her, to understand what made her vibrate. This is too much, she whispered. I can't accept it. It's already yours. Alexander took a step back, restoring the distance between them. Everything in this room belongs to you, regardless of what happens between us. It's in the contract, clause 23. She let out a wet laugh, half sob. Of course it's in the contract. I'm a businessman. There was something that seemed like humor in his voice. But I'm also a man who wanted to give you something real in the midst of all this farce, something that was truly for you. They looked at each other across the bedroom's dimness. The candles someone had lit cast dancing shadows on the book-covered walls. For a moment, Emma forgot this was a business arrangement. For a moment, she only saw a man who had gone beyond any expectation to make her happy. Thank you, she murmured. Alexander. Thank you. He nodded, his expression indecipherable. My rooms are in the West Wing. Thomas can guide you if you need anything. He paused at the threshold. Good night, Emma. I hope you find rest. And he left, leaving her alone, surrounded by literary treasures and questions she didn't know how to formulate. That night, Emma didn't sleep. She wandered among the shelves, caressing leather spines, breathing the aroma of old paper. Every book she opened revealed a margin note, a dedication, a story. They were more than collector's objects. They were fragments of a love for literature she recognized as her own. When dawn began to tint the sky pink over Connecticut, she found herself in front of the window, watching the garden awaken. The early rose bushes opened their petals to the rising sun. A blackbird sang from the branch of a century-old oak tree, and for the first time in months, Emma allowed herself to feel something she had buried deeply: hope. The following weeks became an elaborate choreography of public appearances and private silences. Emma discovered that being Alexander Hayes's wife was a full-time job that no one had taught her to perform. The society magazines published photos of the wedding on their covers. The golden businessman finally conquered, proclaimed Town and Country. The academic Cinderella who captured New York's most coveted bachelor suggested Vanity Fair. Emma read the articles with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing her own image transformed into a fairy tale that was far from reality. The first serious test came 3 weeks after the wedding, a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, organized to raise funds for the restoration of Renaissance works. Alexander had informed her of the event with his usual efficiency. It will be our first official appearance as a married couple, he said during breakfast, without looking up from the Wall Street Journal. My assistant will coordinate with the stylists for your dress. I can choose my own clothes, Emma responded, more sharply than she intended. Alexander looked at her then, an eyebrow raised. Of course, I just thought you'd appreciate help, given that these events have specific codes. Emma's pride fought against practicality. She knew New York gala fashion only from what she saw in society pages while waiting her turn at the neighborhood salon. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of knit sweaters and academic skirts she bought at Macy's clearance sales. Perhaps some guidance wouldn't be bad, she finally admitted. What followed was an intensive immersion in a world Emma completely didn't know. The stylist, a woman named Valerie with impossibly violet-dyed hair, dragged her to designer stores whose names she had only seen in magazines. She tried on dresses that cost more than her annual professor's salary. She learned there were fundamental differences between a clutch and a minaudière, and that wearing the wrong jewelry with the wrong dress could sink a social reputation. "You have a gorgeous body," Valerie told her while adjusting the folds of an emerald green Valentino dress. "You just need to learn to show it without fear." Emma observed herself in the three-way mirror, barely recognizing the woman who returned her gaze. The dress fell over her curves like green water. The neckline revealed enough skin to suggest without vulgarizing. The cut lengthened her silhouette, making her seem taller, more elegant. "Is this me?" she murmured. "This has always been you," Valerie responded. "The world can just see it now." The night of the gala, Emma descended the mansion's main staircase, feeling like an imposter in a designer suit. Alexander waited for her at the foot of the steps, impeccable in his black tuxedo. When he saw her, something changed in his expression. His eyes traveled over her figure with an intensity that made her feel naked, despite all the layers of silk. "You're," he began, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to search for words. "You're absolutely breathtaking." The heat rose to Emma's cheeks. "It's the dress." "No." Alexander approached, placing a grey cashmere shawl on her shoulders that matched his own eyes. "It's you." The car took them to the Met through New York's night streets. Emma watched the city lights flicker beyond the window, trying to calm the trembling of her hands. Alexander noticed her nervousness. "Breathe," he said softly. "You just have to smile, nod, and let me handle the uncomfortable conversations. What if someone asks me something directly? Then you answer. You're a brilliant woman, Emma. You don't need to pretend to be anything else." When they stepped out of the Mercedes in front of the red carpet, camera flashes exploded like fireworks. Emma clung to Alexander's arm as they advanced through the sea of journalists shouting their names. He kept a firm hand on hers, confidently guiding her toward the museum entrance. The interior was even more overwhelming. Hundreds of people dressed in gala attire circulated among the halls, where masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Caravaggio observed impassively from their gilded frames. Emma recognized faces of politicians, actors, heirs to centuries-old fortunes. Everyone seemed to know each other, moving in circles to which she had never belonged. "Alexander, darling," an older woman, bejeweled to absurdity, approached with a predatory smile. "You must introduce me to your charming wife. All of New York is talking about her." "Mrs. Vanderbilt, allow me to introduce my wife, Emma." Alexander made the introductions fluidly. "Emma, Mrs. Vanderbilt is one of the museum's principal benefactors." Emma extended her hand, vaguely remembering Valerie's instructions about society greetings. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vanderbilt." The woman's eyes evaluated her from top to bottom, measuring, cataloguing, judging. "So you're the little professor who conquered our Alexander." Her tone distilled condescension, disguised as cordiality. "It must have been quite a surprise for you, dear, going from dusty classrooms to this." Emma's blood boiled under her carefully made-up skin, but before she could respond, Alexander intervened. "Emma has a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia and is one of the country's leading experts in existentialist literature." His voice was polite but with a steel edge. "I'd say I was the lucky one that she agreed to unite her life with mine." "Mrs. Vanderbilt blinked, momentarily disarmed. Of course, how charming." She walked away shortly after, murmuring excuses about greeting other guests. Emma turned to Alexander, a mixture of gratitude and surprise in her gaze. "You didn't have to do that." "I had to do exactly that." His whiskey eyes shone with what seemed like genuine indignation. "No one insults your intelligence in my presence. Never." The rest of the evening passed in a dance of superficial conversations, bubbly champagne, and calculated smiles. But something had changed between them. Every time someone tried to subtly belittle her, Alexander intervened with deadly elegance, and every time he got lost in financial jargon with some investor, Emma contributed with insightful observations that made the businessman look at her with new respect. They were a team, she discovered with surprise, an improbable but effective team. During dinner, seated at a table presided over by the mayor, Emma found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. The topic drifted toward the restoration of ancient manuscripts. And she could contribute with knowledge that none of the aristocrats present possessed. Alexander watched her, with an expression she couldn't interpret, but that made her feel seen in a way she had forgotten. "Your wife is fascinating," the mayor commented to Alexander as they served dessert. "Where have you been hiding her?" "She wasn't hidden," he responded. "She was just waiting for the world to be ready for her." Emma lowered her gaze, hiding the blush that colored her cheeks. That night, in the car back to Connecticut, the silence between them was different, warmer, more complicit. "You did incredibly well," said Alexander, "better than many people who were born in that world." "It was exhausting," she admitted. "Is it always like this?" "Always, but it gets easier with practice." She looked at him in profile, studying the lines of his face illuminated by the streetlights. "Thank you for defending me. I'm not used to someone—" She stopped, not knowing how to finish the sentence. "To someone valuing your intelligence as much as your presence," he completed. "I know. And that says more about the men you've known than about you." Emma kept silent the rest of the journey, processing emotions she hadn't expected to feel. This man, this cold and calculating businessman who had bought her marriage like someone acquiring property, kept surprising her. There were layers in him that the contract didn't mention, depths that his efficiency facade didn't reveal. And for the first time, Emma wondered if she wanted to discover them. Alexander's family burst into Emma's life like a whirlwind of affection she didn't know how to handle. Margaret Hayes, the clan's matriarch, arrived at the Connecticut estate on a Saturday morning without prior notice, carrying baskets of homemade food and sweeping away the formality Emma had carefully built during the first weeks of marriage. "My dear girl!" exclaimed the woman, enveloping her in an embrace that smelled of lavender and vanilla. "Finally, I can meet you properly." The wedding was beautiful, but there were so many people we could barely talk. Emma found herself returning the embrace almost despite herself. There was something in Margaret's warmth that melted her defenses, that transported her to memories of her own mother she thought buried. "Mrs. Hayes, it's a pleasure." "Margaret, or Mom Margaret if that suits you." The woman's dark eyes shone. No misses between family. Alexander's three sisters arrived shortly after, each a whirlwind of their own personality. Catherine, the eldest, was a successful lawyer with a mordant sense of humor. Sarah, the middle one, directed an art gallery in Soho and spoke with her hands as much as with her mouth. Rebecca, the youngest, was a veterinarian and arrived with her 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, who immediately adopted Emma as her new favorite person. "Aunt Emma," said the girl, climbing into her lap without asking permission, "is it true you have millions of books?" Emma laughed, surprised by the naturalness with which the title of aunt rolled from the little one's lips. "Not millions, but quite a few. Do you like books?" "I like the ones about princesses. But Mum says real princesses don't wait to be rescued." "Your mum is a very wise woman." Margaret had taken possession of the kitchen with the authority of a general, setting aside Alexander's personal chef with a gesture that admitted no reply. Soon, the aroma of New England clam chowder, blueberry pie, and roasted turkey filled the mansion, transforming it from elegant mausoleum into something that resembled more a home. Alexander appeared shortly after noon, clearly surprised to find his house invaded. "Mum, you could have called ahead," he said, though his tone lacked true reproach. "What for? So your poor wife would have to prepare a formal reception?" Margaret waved a wooden spoon in his direction. "We're family, son. Family doesn't call ahead, it appears." Emma observed the interaction with fascination. The Alexander she knew, the implacable businessman, transformed in his mother's presence. His shoulders relaxed, his jaw lost tension, and he even smiled more easily. During lunch, which extended for hours on the terrace under the shade of wisteria-covered pergolas, Emma discovered fragments of family history that explained much about the man she had married. "Alexander was the most serious of my children, even as a boy," Margaret recounted while serving more chowder. "Always with a book in hand, always thinking about something profound. His father said he was born with the weight of the world on his shoulders." "Dad exaggerated," Alexander murmured. "Dad knew you better than you know yourself." Catherine threw him an olive which he caught in the air. I remember when you were 15 and sold your bicycle to buy Mum that pearl brooch she wanted so much. It was her birthday, and you walked to school for 3 months without telling anyone. Emma felt something expand in her chest. Each anecdote, each shared memory, painted a portrait of Alexander that the marriage contract didn't contemplate. A serious boy who became a responsible man too young. A devoted son who carried the expectations of a demanding father. A protective brother who still called his sisters every Sunday without fail. After lunch, while Alexander and Catherine discussed some legal matter, Margaret took Emma to a corner of the garden where an antique rosebush climbed an iron pergola. This rosebush was planted by my mother-in-law when Alexander was born, said the older woman, caressing the petals of a salmon-colored rose. She said it was to remind us that even the most beautiful things need time to flourish. Emma nodded, not really knowing what to respond. I know this marriage didn't start in the traditional way, dear. Margaret looked at her directly, her dark eyes full of ancient wisdom. Alexander thinks he can fool me, but a mother always knows. Emma's heart stopped for an instant. Mrs. Margaret, Shh. The older woman took her hands between hers, calloused from years of domestic work despite her son's wealth. I don't care how it started. What I care about is how it ends. And what I see when my son looks at you, that can't be faked. He doesn't. We don't. He's been in love with you since before you knew he existed. Margaret's words fell like raindrops on dry earth. He thought I wouldn't notice, but I remember the day he came home talking about a bookstore in the village and a woman who argued about poets with more passion than any professor he'd ever met. Emma felt the ground move beneath her feet. That was years ago. 3 years exactly. Margaret smiled tenderly. My son is many things, but impulsive isn't one of them. He wouldn't have done all this if he wasn't absolutely certain of his feelings. Questions crowded Emma's mind, each more urgent than the last. But before she could articulate them, Sophie appeared running, demanding that her new aunt read her a story before nap time. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of children's games, fragmented conversations, and furtive glances Emma exchanged with Alexander across the terrace. Every time their eyes met, he looked away first as if he'd been caught in something forbidden. When the family finally left, leaving behind a warm mess of used dishes and laughter that still seemed to resonate in the walls, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen, helping to clean up despite the staff's protests. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair disheveled from playing with his niece. You survived the Hayes hurricane, he said, with something like an apology in his voice. My family can be intense. Your family is wonderful. Emma looked at him over her shoulder. They're exactly what I always imagined a real family would be. Something crossed his face, a shadow of sadness that disappeared as quickly as it came. You never had that with your father. My father and I were a team of 2. She dried her hands with a kitchen towel. We had each other, and we had the bookstore. It was enough. But this... She gestured toward the cozy chaos surrounding them. This is something different. Alexander took a step toward her, then stopped, as if he'd reached an invisible border. My mother adores you. Your mother is an extraordinary woman, she told me. Emma hesitated. She told me some things I'd like to ask you about us, about how all this really started. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unspoken meanings. Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but his phone rang, breaking the moment. I have to answer this, he murmured, looking at the screen with a furrowed brow. It's urgent. Can we talk later? Emma nodded, though something told her later might take a while to arrive. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered through the library Alexander had created for her. Her fingers traced the spines of books, searching for something she didn't know how to name. Finally, she found what she didn't know she was looking for. A worn copy of Love in the Time of Cholera, tucked between first editions worth fortunes. Opening it, she discovered a dedication written in faded blue ink. For my son, who will someday understand that true love is built with infinite patience, with all my love, Dad. Tears ran down Emma's cheeks without her being able to stop them. That man, that cold and calculating businessman, kept a message of paternal love among his most valuable treasures. Perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps there was more truth in this farce than either of them had dared to admit. The following month brought a series of revelations that shook the foundations of everything Emma thought she knew. It began with an accidental discovery. Alexander had left early for Boston for a business meeting, and she took advantage to explore the mansion with the freedom his absence provided. It was in the study, looking for paper to write a letter to her father, where she found the folder. It was simply labeled Pages and Poetry Project, a name she recognized as her bookstore's. Inside, there were years of meticulous documentation, supplier invoices paid anonymously, loans rejected by banks that inexplicably had been reconsidered, articles about her, clipped from academic journals, annotated with handwriting she now recognized perfectly. Alexander hadn't found her by chance. He had been watching, protecting her for years. The discovery left her breathless, staggering between emotion and fury. What did all this mean? Why hadn't he told her anything? How much of her life had been orchestrated without her knowledge? The questions burned in her mind when he returned 2 days later, exhausted and haggard from a trip that seemed to have taken years off his life. "We need to talk," she said, as soon as he crossed the door. Alexander looked at her with tired eyes. "Can it wait? It's been a difficult trip and—" "No, it can't wait." Emma handed him the folder. "I found this." The color drained from his face. For a moment he seemed older than his 52 years, a man trapped in a lie that had grown out of control. "Emma, how long?" Her voice trembled. "How long have you been watching me, intervening in my life? It's not what it seems." "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing it seems like you bought my marriage like someone buying a troubled company, that you manipulated me for years to get to this moment." Alexander let himself fall into an armchair, running his hands through his hair. "You're right to be furious. You have every right." He looked up at her. "But I need you to understand something before you condemn me." Emma crossed her arms, armoring herself against what was coming. 3 years ago, I entered your bookstore for the first time. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just fleeing from a meeting that had left me questioning every decision of my life. His voice was low, hoarse. "I saw you behind the counter, arguing passionately with a student about whether Hemingway was a cynic or a romantic in disguise. Your eyes shone, your hands flew as you spoke, and I thought I'd never seen anyone so alive. That doesn't justify—" "Let me finish, please." Emma nodded briefly, though every fiber of her body wanted to scream. "I came back the next day, and the next. I'd sit in a corner to read, watching you, listening to how you talked with customers, how you recommended books with extraordinary intuition, how your face lit up when you found the perfect work for someone." Alexander closed his eyes. "I fell in love with you without you even knowing my name. Why didn't you approach me? Because you were brilliant, passionate, independent, and I was a businessman with more money than soul, with a reputation for coldness that had cost me decades to build. What could I offer you? Expensive restaurants and conversations about profit margins?" Emma felt something loosen in her chest, but fought against it. "So you decided to buy me instead of risking rejection. I decided to protect you." The correction was soft, but firm. "When I saw the bookstore was in trouble, I couldn't stand by with my arms crossed. I paid some bills anonymously, interceded with some banks where I had influence. I didn't want anything in return. I just couldn't bear to see something that was so much a part of you disappear." "And the marriage?" "The marriage was my weakness." Alexander finally looked her in the eyes. "When the situation became critical, when I knew nothing I did from the shadows would be enough, I invented this. Madness. I thought if I could be close to you, even under pretense, I'd have a chance for you to know me. For perhaps someday. Perhaps someday what? Perhaps someday you could see me as something more than a rich man trying to buy affection." His voice broke. "It was selfish, it was manipulative, and if you want to end this right now, I'll sign the divorce papers tonight. The bookstore will still be yours with all legal guarantees. I won't ask for anything in return." The silence stretched between them, heavy as lead. Emma processed each word, each confession trying to reconcile the man before her with the image she had built of him. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think." "Of course." Alexander stood, his posture one of absolute defeat. "I'll take the guest room. When you're ready to talk or to ask me to leave, Atsmaka, I'll be here." Emma watched him walk away down the hall, his heavy steps echoing in the mansion's silence. When he disappeared from view, she allowed herself to collapse onto the sofa, the folder still pressed against her chest. Emotions hit her like waves, fury at the manipulation, confusion at the feelings his confession awakened, fear that all of this was simply another layer of lies. But underneath it all, persistent as a melody she couldn't forget, there was something that looked dangerously like hope. She spent the night reading every document in the folder, every paid invoice, every letter interceding for her, every underlined article. It wasn't the file of a hunter stalking prey. It was the archive of someone deeply in love, someone who had dedicated years to protecting from a distance a woman who didn't even know he existed. At dawn, she made a decision. She wasn't ready to forgive completely. She wasn't ready to trust without reserves, but she also wasn't ready to let go of the possibility that all of this could be real. She found Alexander in the kitchen making coffee with hands that trembled slightly. He looked at her with eyes reddened from a sleepless night. "I'm not leaving," she said without preamble. "Not yet. But things are going to change. Whatever you want. I want honesty. Absolute brutal honesty. If we're going to try to make this work, I need to know there are no more secrets." Alexander nodded fervently. "Ask whatever you want. I'll tell you everything." "And I want..." She hesitated, searching for the words. "I want the chance to truly know you. Not the businessman, not the strategist. The man who read Walt Whitman with me that first afternoon." For the first time in days, something like hope illuminated his face. "That man has been waiting for you his whole life." The weeks that followed were a controlled demolition of everything they had built, followed by reconstruction from the foundations. Emma established new rules, dinners together, at least 4 times a week, where they would talk about everything except business or contracts. Sunday walks through Central Park, where he would tell her stories of his childhood, and she of hers. Weekly visits to the bookstore, where they would work together, reorganizing inventory and rediscovering forgotten treasures among the shelves. At first, the discomfort was palpable. 2 people accustomed to their armor, forced to present themselves vulnerable before each other. But gradually, the layers began to fall. Emma discovered that Alexander had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh when she least expected it, that he hummed Italian opera while cooking, badly but enthusiastically, that he cried unashamedly at Nora Ephron movies and flatly denied having done so 5 minutes later. Alexander discovered that Emma talked to books while organizing them, whispering secrets to them as if they were old friends, that she got completely lost in reading, capable of spending hours motionless with a volume in her hands while the world spun around her, that she had a terrible fear of thunderstorms, inheritance from a childhood night she had never been able to forget. One May afternoon, while working in the bookstore cataloguing a new acquisition of 18th century manuscripts, Emma asked the question she had been saving for weeks. "Why did you never marry before?" Alexander stopped writing, his pen suspended over the register. "I almost did once, many years ago." "What happened?" "She wanted me for what I represented, not for who I was." His voice was neutral, but Emma detected ancient pain underneath. "When my father got sick and I had to take over the family business, I stopped being the fun and carefree man she'd known. I became this." He gestured toward himself. Serious, responsible, boring, according to her words. "You're not boring." Alexander looked at her with genuine surprise. "I'm literally a middle-aged man who gets excited about first editions of century-old books." "That's not boring," Emma smiled. "It's passionate. There's a difference." The air between them charged with something indefinable. Alexander looked away first, returning to his work with exaggerated concentration. "And you?" he asked after a moment. Why did I never let anyone get close enough?" Emma sighed. "There was someone, years ago, a colleague from the university. I thought he understood my passion for literature, my dedication to work. But in the end, he wanted me to be less intense, to prioritize other things. Him, a conventional family, a life I'd never desired. And you let him go? I let him go. Her eyes found his. But not because I didn't want love, just because I didn't want a love that forced me to be less than what I am. Alexander held her gaze. I would never ask that of you. I know. The admission came out softer than she intended. I think I always knew. The moment broke when a customer entered looking for a particular edition of Faulkner, but something had changed between them. A crack in the wall separating them, small but significant. That night, after dining together on the terrace under Connecticut stars, Alexander stopped in front of Emma's bedroom door. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me another chance." "I'm not giving it to you." Emma tilted her head. "You're earning it." A genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him without reserves, illuminated his face. "Then I'll keep working." The days became weeks, the weeks months. Summer arrived in Connecticut with its implacable heat, and with it, a new normalcy in the estate. Emma found herself looking forward to shared breakfasts, literary discussions that extended until dawn, comfortable silences that no longer needed to be filled. Margaret and the sisters had become regular presences, their visits transforming the mansion into something that increasingly resembled a home. Emma learned to cook clam chowder under the matriarch's tutelage, to discuss art with Sarah, to laugh at Catherine's terrible jokes. Little Sophie called her favorite aunt, regardless of her real aunt's protests. And Alexander. Alexander revealed himself layer by layer, like a book she read slowly, savoring each page. The man behind the businessman was more complex, more tender, more vulnerable than she ever would have imagined. He looked at her as if she were a miracle that was still there, as if each day by her side was a gift he didn't deserve. But even in the midst of that flourishing intimacy, Emma kept a part of herself guarded. The fear of total vulnerability, the terror of giving her heart completely only to see it destroyed, made her retreat just when she seemed about to take the definitive step. And Alexander, with the infinite patience his father had taught him, waited. Without pressuring, without demanding. Simply being there, being exactly who she needed him to be. Until one August afternoon, everything changed. The call came at 3 a.m, tearing Emma from a dream where she walked through an infinite library, holding hands with someone whose face she couldn't see. "Hello?" she murmured, still half asleep. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Nurse Patricia from your father's care facility." The woman's voice trembled. "Mr. Richardson has had an episode. He's stable, but we think you should come." The world stopped. Emma wouldn't even remember later how she got to the hallway, how she knocked on Alexander's door, how the words came stumbling from her mouth between sobs. She would only remember his arms surrounding her, his voice whispering, "I'm coming with you," the security of his presence as the driver drove through the night toward Connecticut. The 4-hour journey was an agony of silence and intertwined hands. Alexander didn't try to fill the void with empty words of comfort. He was just there, solid as a rock in the middle of the stormy sea of her terror. When they arrived at the facility, the sun was beginning to rise over Long Island Sound. Emma ran through the hallways to her father's room, her heart beating so loudly it drowned out any other sound. James Richardson lay in bed, smaller and more fragile than she remembered. His eyes, those blue eyes that had always looked at her with unconditional love, wandered lost across the ceiling. "Dad," she whispered, taking his wrinkled hand. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, James's eyes focused on her face. "Emma, is that you? My girl?" Tears ran down her cheeks. "It's me, Dad. I'm here. I dreamed the bookstore was full of light." A ghostly smile curved the old man's lips. "Your mother was there, organizing the books like she liked. She said she was proud of you." Emma sobbed, pressing her father's hand against her cheek. "The bookstore is fine, Dad. It's safe. And you, my girl, are you safe?" Before she could answer, the door opened softly. Alexander entered, his steps cautious on the linoleum floor. James's eyes moved toward him, and for a fleeting instant, a spark of recognition crossed the fog of his mind. "You," he murmured. "You're the bookman, the one who came to talk about Whitman." Alexander approached, kneeling beside the bed. "Yes, Mr. Richardson, it's me. Take care of her." The old man's voice became urgent, surprisingly clear. "My Emma pretends to be strong, but she has a glass heart. Promise me you'll take care of her. I promise." Alexander took the man's other hand. "With my life, if necessary." James nodded, satisfied. His eyes closed and his breathing became slower, deeper. It wasn't the end, the doctors would explain later. Just the exhaustion of a man who had fought all night to stay conscious until he saw his daughter. Emma remained beside her father for hours, watching the rise and fall of his chest, memorizing every line of his face as if it were the last time. Alexander sat in a corner of the room, silent but present, a vigil she hadn't asked for but appreciated more than she could express. When the doctors finally convinced her to go rest, assuring her James would sleep peacefully until the next day, Emma let herself be guided to a small guest room in the facility. Her legs barely supported her. Her mind was chaos of emotions she didn't know how to process. "You should sleep," said Alexander, removing his jacket to cover her as she sat on the edge of the bed. "I can't." Her voice broke. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him as he was before. Strong, full of life, reading me stories with different voices for each character. How can someone fade like this? How can the person you love most become a stranger?" Alexander sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "He hasn't gone yet, and while he's here, you can keep creating memories. Different, perhaps, but equally valuable. And when he's no longer here," tears flowed freely now, "who will remember with me the afternoons in the bookstore? Who will understand why the smell of old books makes me cry?" "I will understand." Alexander's voice was soft but firm. "I've been listening to those stories, remembering them. You don't have to carry those memories alone, Emma." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw something she had been too scared to recognize. Love. A patient, constant love that asked for nothing in return. A love that had waited years for her, that had crossed lines it shouldn't have crossed, but always with the intention of protecting her. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. Not just of losing my father. I'm scared of feeling what I'm feeling, of needing you, of letting someone be so important they could destroy me if they left." Alexander took her hand, the most intimate gesture they had shared. "We're all scared of that. The difference is that some of us decide the risk is worth it." "What if I break?" "Then I'll help you rebuild, piece by piece, however long it takes." Emma didn't know who moved first. She only knew that suddenly she was in his arms, crying against his chest while he held her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. There was nothing romantic about that embrace, nothing physical beyond comfort. It was simply two people who had dropped their masks, finally meeting in the vulnerable space between them. "Stay with me," she whispered against his shirt. "Tonight, just stay. I'm not going anywhere." They stayed like that, embracing in that small room as dawn painted the sky over Long Island Sound. And when Emma finally fell asleep, exhausted by tears and terror, she did so with the certainty that, whatever happened, she was no longer alone. The days that followed tested every fiber of Emma's resilience. James alternated between moments of terrifying lucidity and episodes of confusion, where he didn't recognize his own daughter. There were hours when he talked animatedly about books, shared memories, about Emma's mother with a clarity that made her heart ache. And then, without warning, he would look at her with empty eyes and ask who that stranger in his room was. Emma settled in Connecticut indefinitely, cancelling her summer classes at the university with an excuse of family emergency. Alexander returned to New York to attend to business that couldn't wait, but called every night without fail, listening to her outbursts, her fears, her moments of desperation. "Today he asked about Mom," Emma told him one night, her voice hollow from exhaustion. "He wanted to know when she was coming to visit. When I told him that she died more than 25 years ago, he looked at me like I'd stabbed him with a knife. I'm sorry, sweetheart." The endearment slipped from Alexander, and neither commented on it. "Do you want me to come?" "No, yes, I don't know." She rubbed her eyes. I don't know what I want. I don't know anything except that I'm so tired I could sleep for a whole year. Then rest. I'll be here when you wake up. But resting was impossible. Emma wandered the facility's hallways at all hours, unable to move too far in case her father needed her. The other residents began to recognize her, greeting her with the silent camaraderie of those who share a similar vigil. One afternoon, while James slept, one of the nurses sat beside her in the waiting room. "You're the bookseller's daughter, right?" asked the woman, who introduced herself as Hope. "Mr. Richardson talks a lot about you. Even on his worst days, he always says he has a daughter who inherited his mother's eyes and the soul of books." Emma smiled weakly. "That sounds like him." "He also talks about a man." Hope looked at her with curiosity. "He says a gentleman of books came to ask for your hand, that he told him he would love you like first editions are loved, with infinite care and absolute reverence." Emma's heart flipped. When did he say that? A flash of something vulnerability crossed Hope's face. Months ago, before his last serious episode, he was very lucid that day. He said he could finally die peacefully because he knew his daughter would be in good hands. Tears threatened to overflow again. Emma excused herself, seeking refuge in the facility's garden where palm trees cast shadows on stone benches. Alexander had visited her father. He had told her, but she hadn't understood the magnitude of what that meant. It wasn't just a formality, an empty gesture to complete the farce of the convenient marriage. It was a man in love seeking the blessing of the father of the woman he loved, making promises he intended to keep. Why was it so hard for her to believe it? Why, even now, after everything Alexander had demonstrated, did part of her keep waiting for the moment when he would disappoint her? The answer came with the brutal clarity of self-awareness, because it was easier to protect herself behind cynicism than to risk being destroyed by hope. The weeks dragged on. James had better days and terrible days. The bookstore in New York kept functioning under the supervision of the staff Alexander had hired, but Emma felt its absence like a phantom limb. Her books, her refuge, were hundreds of miles away while she consumed herself in a facility that smelled of disinfectant and imminent loss. And then, in the middle of everything, came the news that finished breaking her. Alexander called one morning with a strange voice, too controlled to be natural. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you not to get upset until I finish explaining." Emma's stomach sank. "What's happening?" "There's a problem with the business. A group of investors is pressuring me to sell one of the subsidiaries. If I do..." He hesitated. "If I do, I'll have to liquidate some personal assets, including..." "Including what, Alexander?" "The bookstore could be at risk." The world stopped. The bookstore, her father's legacy. The reason she had accepted all this in the first place. "You promised me," she whispered. "You promised it would be safe. And it will be. I'm working on alternatives, looking for other investors, restructuring debts. But I needed you to know the truth, even if it's hard to hear. The truth." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "It seems the truth between us always arrives late and costs dearly. Emma, I need time. I can't process this now. My father is here, possibly dying, and now you tell me everything I sacrificed my dignity for could vanish anyway. I'm not going to let that happen. You said that before." The words came out sharper than she intended, and look where we are. She hung up without saying goodbye, something she had never done. Then she sat in the facility's garden and cried until she had no tears left. That night, alone in the small room that had become her temporary cell, Emma made a decision. She couldn't keep living in uncertainty, oscillating between hope and fear. She needed answers. She needed to know, once and for all, if the love Alexander professed was real or just another illusion in a life built on quicksand. And for that, she would have to confront him, face to face, without masks or excuses. Emma returned to New York 3 weeks later, when her father's condition stabilized enough to allow her to be absent for a few days. The train journey felt eternal. Each mile that brought her closer to the Connecticut estate loaded with the tension of an inevitable confrontation. Alexander was waiting for her at the station, something she hadn't anticipated. He looked haggard, with dark shadows under his eyes and a pallor suggesting sleepless nights. He saw her before she noticed him, and the expression of relief that crossed his face was so genuine, it almost melted the armor Emma had built during the journey. Almost. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice cold, professional. "I wanted to." He took her suitcase without asking. "How's your father?" "Better. The doctors say it's a plateau, not a real improvement, but at least he's stable." They walked to the car in tense silence. The driver drove through New York traffic, while they sat at opposite ends of the back seat, an ocean of unspoken words separating them. "We need to talk," Emma said finally, as they entered the property. "I know. Not in the house. I don't want the staff to hear this." Alexander nodded, directing her toward a path that wound through the gardens to a small gazebo hidden among myrtle hedges. It was a place she didn't know, a private corner where climbing roses created a vault of white and pink petals. They sat on a stone bench, facing each other for the first time in weeks. Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception, manipulation. She only found exhaustion, and something that seemed like genuine fear. "Talk to me," she said. "Tell me exactly what's happening with the business. No euphemisms, no protecting me. The complete truth." Alexander breathed deeply. "A year ago, before formally meeting you, I made a risky investment. A real estate development in New Jersey that seemed safe, but got complicated by changes in environmental regulations. I lost. A lot. More than I should have risked." "How much?" "Enough to put the holding's stability at risk. I managed to contain it, restructure, but some of my partners lost confidence. Now they want me to liquidate assets to demonstrate solvency. And the bookstore. The bookstore is in my name as collateral for a loan I used to finance the improvements we made. If I liquidate badly, if I don't find another solution, I could." His voice broke. "I could lose it." Emma felt the cold of terror run through her. So all this was for nothing? No. Alexander stood up, beginning to pace the small space. "It wasn't for nothing. I have a plan. There's a group of German investors interested in acquiring the construction division, which is the one with problems. If I can close that deal, I can clean up the accounts without touching the bookstore. And if you don't succeed, I will succeed. But if you don't," she insisted, "I need to know the worst scenario, Alexander. I need to be able to prepare." He stopped, turning his back to her. "If I don't succeed, I'll lose the bookstore, I'll lose the mansion, I'll lose almost everything." "And me?" The question came out before she could stop it. "Where do I fit in all this?" Alexander turned. His whiskey eyes shone with an emotion she didn't dare name. "You're free. The prenuptial agreement protects you. Whatever happens with my finances, you're guaranteed compensation that will allow you to start over. Buy another bookstore if you want, or do whatever you wish with your life." "And is that what you want? For me to leave when things get difficult?" "No." The word came out like a contained roar. "What I want is for you to stay. What I want is to be able to give you everything I promised and more. What I want is not to have failed you before even having the chance to show you what I feel." "Then show me now. How?" Emma stood, closing the distance between them. "Tell me the truth. Not the truth of business, not the truth of contracts. The truth of why you did all this, the truth of what you feel. No strategies, no protections, just the truth." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, as if each word cost him superhuman effort, he began to speak. "I love you. I've loved you since before you knew I existed. I love you when you argue about literature with a passion that illuminates your entire face. I love you when you fall asleep with a book on your chest. I love you when you're strong and when you're vulnerable and when you're impossibly stubborn." Tears began to fall down Emma's cheeks, but she made no move to stop them. "I did all this because I couldn't stand the idea of you losing what you loved most. Yes, it was manipulative. Yes, it was selfish, but it was also the most honest act of my life. Because for the first time I acted for something that had nothing to do with money or power or strategy. I acted for love, even though I did it wrong, even though I did it all backwards. Alexander took a step toward her, then stopped, as if afraid to cross a line. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll sign whatever's necessary. I'll give you everything I can save from this disaster. But if there's any possibility, the slightest possibility that you can forgive me and give me one last chance, then I'll fight. I'll fight the whole world to keep you by my side. The silence that followed was absolute. Emma could hear the beating of her own heart, the whisper of wind through the roses, the ragged breathing of the man before her. And then she made a decision. I don't want your money, she said. I don't want your guarantees or your contracts. The only thing I ever wanted, though it took me time to admit it, was this: the truth, your truth. And now that you have it, now... Emma closed her eyes for a moment, gathering courage. Now I need time to process it. But I'm not going to leave, Alexander. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The hope that illuminated his face was almost painful to witness. What do you need? I'll do anything. I need us to fight together, not you protecting me from reality, but both of us facing it side by side. Can you do that? I can try. Then start by showing me those accounting books. If we're going to save the bookstore, I want to know exactly what we're fighting against. For the first time in weeks, Alexander smiled. Not the small, contained smile she knew, but a wide, genuine one that transformed his face into something almost youthful. You're extraordinary. Did you know that? I'm beginning to suspect it. The weeks that followed were the most intense of Emma's life. Days were divided between trips to Connecticut to see her father and nights in New York studying numbers that made her head hurt. Alexander kept his word. He showed her everything, every transaction, every loss, every risky bet that had gone wrong. The transparency was brutal, and more than once Emma had to contain the impulse to scream in frustration at decisions that seemed incomprehensible to her. But she also learned. She learned that the world of high-level business was a minefield where one wrong step could destroy decades of work. She learned that Alexander, beneath his facade of coldness, was a man who took risks because he believed in possibilities others dismissed. She learned that the fortune she had assumed inexhaustible was, in reality, a house of cards carefully balanced. "Why didn't you ever tell me things were so fragile?" she asked him one night, surrounded by papers and cups of cold coffee. "Because I wanted to protect you." Alexander rubbed his reddened eyes. "And because, honestly, I thought I could fix it before it mattered." Pride is a very masculine flaw. Mine more than most, apparently. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, something grew between them. Work nights turned into conversations that went beyond numbers. He told her about his father, a demanding man who had prepared him to inherit an empire, but never taught him to rest. She spoke to him about her mother, about shared reading Sundays, about how her loss had closed her to the world for years. "I think I fell in love with books because they couldn't abandon me," she confessed one early morning when defenses were lowest. "People leave, die, disappoint you, but a book is always there, the same as the day you first opened it." "I'm here too," Alexander responded softly, "and I don't plan to leave." The moment hung between them, loaded with possibilities. Emma felt the impulse to lean toward him, to close the distance that still separated them. But something stopped her, the persistent fear, the voice in her head that reminded her of all the times she had trusted and ended up alone. "We should sleep," she murmured, breaking the spell. "Tomorrow we have the meeting with the Germans." If Alexander felt disappointment, he hid it well. "You're right. We need to be fresh for this." The meeting with the German investors was a partial success. They were interested but wanted more guarantees, more time, more of everything. Alexander negotiated with a skill Emma observed, fascinated, seeing for the first time the businessman who had built an empire from nothing. He was implacable but fair, demanding but reasonable, a balance that required decades of practice. But even with the progress, the pressure didn't diminish. The other investors grew impatient. Bank calls became more frequent, and time, that resource that couldn't be bought, was running out. One afternoon, while Emma reviewed contracts in the study, Margaret appeared without warning. The older woman had an expression Emma hadn't seen before, concern mixed with determination. I need to talk to you, dear. Alone. Emma put down the papers, intrigued. Of course. What's happening? Margaret sat across from her, taking her hands between hers. I know what's happening with the business. Alexander thinks he can hide it from me, but a mother always knows. Her dark eyes shone. I also know what's between you two, the dance you've been doing for months without daring to take the final step. Margaret, let me finish. The woman's voice was firm but kind. My son has made mistakes. He's been stubborn, proud, incapable of asking for help. But he's also the most loyal and loving man I know, though it's hard for him to show it. He loves you, Emma. He loves you in a way I never saw in him with anyone else. I know. The admission came out easier than expected. I think I also. But I'm so scared. Fear is natural. What matters is what you do with it. Margaret squeezed her hands. You can let it paralyze you, keep you safe but alone. Or you can go through it, accept that love always carries risk and decide it's worth trying anyway. What if I'm wrong? What if in the end all this ends badly? Then you'll have loved, you'll have lived, and that's more than many can say. Margaret leaned forward. My late husband used to say that tragedy isn't losing what you love. Tragedy is never having dared to love in the first place. The words settled in Emma's heart like seeds waiting to germinate. That night, when Alexander returned from another exhausting meeting, she found him waiting in the study. She had made a decision, though she still trembled at the thought of it. Is something wrong? He asked, worried by her expression. Yes. It's that I've been a coward. Emma. No, let me speak. She stood facing him. I've spent months looking for excuses to keep distance, telling myself it was prudent, that it was smart to protect my heart. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of feeling what I feel for you. And what do you feel? I feel. Her voice broke, but she pushed forward. I feel you've become the person I most want to see when I wake up. I feel your flaws matter to me as much as your virtues, because they're part of who you are. I feel that for the first time in my life, I can imagine a future that includes another person without it making me feel trapped. Alexander took a step toward her, then another, until only centimeters separated them. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you, Alexander Hayes, even though it scares me, even though I don't know how this ends. I love you, and I don't want to pretend it's not true anymore. The kiss that followed wasn't like the wedding kiss, chaste and public. It was the kiss of two people who had waited too long, who had fought against the inevitable and finally surrendered. It was desperate and tender in equal parts, a promise made with lips instead of words. When they finally separated, both were crying. I thought this moment would never come, he whispered, his forehead against hers. Me too. Emma smiled through tears. But here we are. Here we are, he repeated. And whatever happens with everything else, this is all that matters. Love, Emma discovered, didn't solve problems, but it made facing them infinitely more bearable. The following weeks brought a mixture of triumphs and setbacks. The German investors finally accepted Alexander's terms, securing the construction division and relieving immediate pressure. But other problems arose. A partner who demanded greater participation, a project delayed by municipal permits, a global economy that wobbled, threatening to drag everything in its path. Through each crisis, Emma was by his side, no longer as the convenience wife who pretended in public, but as a real partner who shared sleepless nights and mornings of renewed hope. She learned to read financial statements with the same attention she dedicated to literary texts. She discovered that her analytical mind, trained in years of academic interpretation, adapted surprisingly well to the business world. You have a gift for this, Alexander told her one afternoon, after she detected an inconsistency in a contract his lawyers had overlooked. I have a gift for reading between the lines, she corrected. Business texts aren't so different from literary ones. Both hide more than they show. The bookstore, miraculously, was saved. Alexander managed to restructure the loan, using other assets as collateral, and the small village location kept opening its doors every morning. Emma began to divide her time between classes at the university, hours in the store, and nights in the Connecticut estate that finally began to feel like her home. Her father had an unexpected improvement. Doctors couldn't fully explain it, but James went through a period of lucidity that allowed Emma to spend hours conversing with him, like in old times. She told him about Alexander, about the love she had found when she least expected it. James listened with that wise smile he had always had, and when she finished, he took her hand with the surprising strength of someone who has something important to say. "The book, gentleman," he murmured. "I knew he was special when he came to see me. I knew he would make you happy." "How did you know, Dad?" "Because he asked me about your favorite books. Not about your beauty, not about your intelligence, not about anything that could impress. He wanted to know what stories had formed you, what words had healed you." James smiled. "A man who asks those questions is a man who wants to know your soul, not just your exterior." Those words stayed with Emma long after her father's lucidity faded again. They were a gift, a late blessing, but no less valuable. Autumn arrived in Connecticut with its palette of golds and coppers, the estate dressed in warm colors, and with them came a new normalcy for Emma and Alexander. They no longer slept in separate rooms. There was no longer polite distance in daily gestures. They had become those couples she had always observed, with a mixture of envy and skepticism. Those who touch without thinking, who finish each other's sentences, who share a private language built from stolen moments. One October Sunday, while walking through Central Park holding hands, Alexander stopped in front of Bethesda Fountain. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice unusually nervous. Emma felt her heart accelerate. "Tell me. I know our marriage started as an arrangement. I know you didn't have a real choice, that circumstances pushed you to accept something you never would have considered otherwise." Alexander took her hands in his. "But now that things are different, now that what we have is real, I want to do it right." From his jacket pocket, he took out a small blue velvet box. When he opened it, Emma saw a different ring than the wedding one she already wore. This one was more delicate, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, an evidently antique piece. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "She gave it to my mother on her wedding day, and she gave it to me with the condition that I only give it to someone I truly loved." His whiskey eyes shone with contained emotion. "Emma Richardson, would you do me the honor of marrying me? Not for convenience, not for contracts, for love. Only for love." Tears ran down Emma's cheeks, but this time they were of a joy so pure it almost hurt. "We're already married, silly," she laughed through sobs. "Then marry me again. Let me give you the wedding you should have had, the proposal you deserved, the promise that this is forever, not just for a contractual year." She didn't need to think about it. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. Alexander slid the ring onto her finger next to the wedding band she already wore. Then he kissed her, there in the middle of Central Park, not caring about passing tourists or children pointing at them. It was a kiss of celebration, of renewed promises, of two people who had found their way back to each other through all obstacles. The second wedding was intimate, barely close family and some friends. It was celebrated in the estate's garden, under the same gazebo where months earlier they had had their toughest confrontation. Emma wore a simple ivory dress, and Alexander cried openly when he saw her walk toward him. Margaret read a poem by Maya Angelou. The sisters served as witnesses. Little Sophie carried the rings with a comic solemnity for her 7 years, and when they said "I do" for the second time, the words had a weight and truth the first ceremony never had. That night, after the guests left and the mansion fell silent, Emma and Alexander sat on their bedroom balcony, watching the stars over Connecticut. "Who would have said we'd end up like this?" she murmured, cuddled against his chest. "I always knew." His voice vibrated with satisfaction. "From the day I saw you arguing about Hemingway, I knew you were my destiny." "That sounds terribly corny." "Love is corny. That doesn't make it less true." Emma laughed softly, thinking about how far they had come, from a cold contract to this warmth that enveloped them. From two strangers pretending to two intertwined souls. The path had been tortuous, painful at times, but worth every tear shed. "I love you," she said, because she would never tire of saying it. "And I you." Today, tomorrow, and all the days we have left. The peace lasted 3 months. It arrived as a call at 4 in the morning, tearing them from sleep with the brutality of bad news. It was the Connecticut facility. James had suffered another episode, more severe than previous ones. This time, doctors couldn't promise anything. The journey to Connecticut was a painful déjà vu, but this time, Emma wasn't alone. Alexander drove through the night, while she held his hand tightly enough to leave marks. When they arrived, James was conscious but weak. His eyes, which had wandered lost for so long, seemed strangely clear. "My girl," he whispered, when Emma leaned beside his bed. "You came." "I'll always come, Dad. Always." The old man smiled, a smile that seemed to belong to younger, healthier days. "I had a beautiful dream. Your mother was there. She told me I could rest, that you'd be okay now." His eyes moved toward Alexander, who remained at the door. "The book, gentleman. Come closer, son." Alexander obeyed, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here, Mr. Richardson. You kept your promise." The old man's voice was barely a thread, but loaded with meaning. "I can see it in her eyes. She's happy. Finally happy." "It's the honor of my life, sir." James nodded, satisfied. Then his eyes returned to Emma. "The bookstore. It's safe, Dad. Flourishing as you always wanted." "Good, good." The old man's eyelids began to close. "I'm so tired, my girl, so tired of fighting this fog." Emma felt tears run down her cheeks. "Then rest, Dad. I'll be here when you wake up." But even as she said it, she knew something had changed. Doctors entered shortly after with somber expressions. The episode had caused significant damage. James remained stable, but his body was gradually giving up. The following days were the most difficult of Emma's life. She spent hours beside her father's bed, reading aloud the books they had shared when she was a child. Alexander took turns with her, making sure she ate, that she rested even if briefly, that she didn't consume herself in the vigil. One afternoon, while Emma dozed in the chair beside the bed, James opened his eyes with sudden lucidity. "The first book I read you was Charlotte's Web," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "You were 4 years old. You cried when we got to the part about the spider." Emma woke startled, taking her father's hand. "Dad." "It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer," he quoted. "I never forgot that line. It taught me everything I needed to know about loving you." Tears flowed freely now. "I love you, Dad. I love you so much." "I know, my girl, I know." James smiled. "Take care of the bookstore. Take care of your gentleman. And when you think of me, remember I'll be between the pages of every book you open." He closed his eyes, and this time the sleep was deep, prolonged. It lasted 2 more weeks, a soft twilight where moments of consciousness became increasingly rare. Emma read to him, talked to him, sang him the songs he sang to her when she was little, and when he finally left, it was peacefully with a smile on his lips and his daughter's hand holding his. The funeral was intimate, only those closest saying goodbye to a man who had dedicated his life to words. Emma delivered a speech she had written the night before, a tribute to a father who had taught her to love stories and, through them, to love life. "My father believed every book contained a fragment of immortality," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "that as long as their pages were read, the souls of those who wrote them would remain alive. Today, I promise him his soul will live in the bookstore he loved so much. Every book sold, every story shared, will be a tribute to James Richardson, the man who taught me that words can heal even the most broken hearts." Alexander was by her side during every moment, holding her hand, offering his shoulder when tears became too much. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty words of comfort. He was just present, solid, constant. In the following weeks, Emma went through grief like someone navigating a stormy sea. There were good days where she could remember her father with smiles, and dark days where the pain left her paralyzed. Alexander learned to recognize the signs, to give her space when she needed it, and to embrace her when the walls became too oppressive. One night, about a month after the funeral, Emma found herself wandering through the bookstore after closing. She had formerly inherited the location, along with the modest collection her father had kept in a Connecticut warehouse. While organizing the shelves, she found something that made her stop, an old envelope hidden behind a row of books. Inside was a letter, written with the trembling handwriting of her father's last years of lucidity. My dear Emma, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to tell you in person, but I need you to know something important. When your mother died, I thought I would never be happy again. The pain was so great it drowned me. But then I looked at you, with your eyes full of questions and your heart wide open, and I understood that love doesn't end with loss, it transforms. I had wonderful years with you, my girl. Years of shared books, laughter, learning together that life is as much tragedy as comedy. And although illness stole many things from me, it could never steal the love I feel for you. Now I ask one last favor. Be happy. Not just in the small, safe way you always chose. Be wildly, madly happy. Dare to love as if you weren't afraid, because the truth, my daughter, is that the only real mistake is not having loved enough. Your book gentleman seems like a good man. Give him a chance. Give yourself a chance. True love doesn't come often, and when it does, you have to grab it with both hands. I will love you always, in this life and the one to come. Your father, James. Emma read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words until she could barely distinguish them. Then she carefully put it away in her purse, next to her heart. When she got home that night, she found Alexander waiting for her in the study, worried about her lateness. "Are you okay?" he asked, scanning her face for signs of another crisis. "Better than okay." Emma showed him the letter. "My father left this for me. I think he knew I would need it exactly at this moment." Alexander read the letter in silence. When he finished, his eyes shone. "He was a wise man, your father. The wisest I knew." Emma approached, surrounding him with her arms. "And he was right, you know? About everything, especially about you. About me? About giving you a chance. About not being afraid to love." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for being here. There's no other place I'd want to be." They stayed embracing in the study's silence, 2 people who had crossed storms and come out the other side stronger. The pain of loss would still be there, Emma knew, but beside it was love, and love, as her father had said, had the power to transform everything. 1 year after James's death, Pages and Poetry Bookstore celebrated its renovation anniversary with an opening that attracted literati, academics, and book lovers from all over the East Coast. Emma had worked tirelessly to transform the small location into something that truly honored her father's legacy. With Alexander's help, they had acquired the adjoining space, doubling the store's size. They had installed a cozy reading corner, a small cafe serving James's favorite coffee, and an event space where authors could present their works. But the true jewel of the renovation was in the basement, an archive room where James Richardson's personal collection was kept, available for researchers and scholars. Each document was meticulously catalogued, each manuscript protected with the care it deserved. It was a temple to the love of words, a permanent tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to preserving them. The night of the opening, Emma found herself overwhelmed by the response. University colleagues, old bookstore customers, editors and writers filled the space to overflowing. Conversations flowed like rivers of enthusiasm, and the sound of laughter mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. At one point in the evening, Margaret pulled her aside to a quiet corner. "Your father would be very proud," said the older woman, taking her hands. "Not just of this, but of who you've become." "I couldn't have done it without you all," Emma responded, sincere. "Without Alexander, without you, without the whole family. Family isn't just what you're born into, dear. It's also what you choose." Margaret smiled with that wisdom Emma had come to value so much. "And speaking of family, is there anything you want to tell me?" Emma felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't planned to say anything yet. The secret was too new, too precious to share. But under Margaret's perceptive gaze, the words came out before she could stop them. "I'm pregnant," she whispered it, almost afraid that saying it aloud would make it disappear. "I found out 2 weeks ago. Alexander doesn't know yet." Margaret's eyes instantly filled with tears. "Oh dear, oh my girl." She hugged her tightly. This is wonderful. I'm 40 years old, Emma murmured against her shoulder. The doctors say it's a high-risk pregnancy. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure that— Shh! Margaret pulled back, holding her face in her hands. Listen to me well. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, the whole family. But right now, in this moment, you just have to be happy. You've created life, Emma. The life you and my son will build together. That night, after the last guest left and the bookstore fell silent, Emma led Alexander to the reading corner where it all began years ago, when he was just a stranger watching her argue about poets. I have something to tell you, she began, her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Everything okay? Concern crossed his face. You've been distracted all night. More than okay. She took his hands, placing them on her still flat belly. Alexander, we're going to be parents. The silence that followed seemed eternal. She watched as emotions crossed his face, confusion, understanding, disbelief, and finally, a joy so pure it transformed his features into something almost youthful. Are we going to— Words stumbled over each other. Emma, are you sure? Completely sure. I confirmed it with the doctor. I'm almost 3 months along. Alexander fell to his knees before her, pressing his forehead against her belly with almost religious reverence. A baby, he whispered. Our baby. Tears ran down both their cheeks, but they were tears of a happiness that surpassed anything they had experienced before. In that small corner of a century-old bookstore, surrounded by books containing all the stories ever told, they were beginning their own. I'm going to be a father, Alexander said, standing to embrace her. At my age, when I had already accepted that would never happen. You've given me. His voice broke. You've given me everything, Emma. Everything I never dared to dream. And you to me, she caressed his face, drying his tears. My father was right. True love doesn't come often, but when it does, you have to grab it with both hands. They stayed embracing until dawn began to peek through the bookstore windows, painting the book spines with golden tones. The outside world awakened with its usual noise, but inside that sacred space, two people celebrated the oldest miracle of all, the continuation of life, of the story, of the love that refused to end. What will we name them? Asked Alexander, his hand still on her belly. If it's a boy, I'd like. Would it be okay with you, James? Emma sobbed a laugh. Nothing would make me happier. And if it's a girl? Margaret. She didn't have to think about it. For the woman who taught me that family is chosen as much as inherited. Alexander nodded, moved. James, or Margaret Hayes Richardson, our child, our future. Our everything, she completed. And in that moment, with the words of thousands of stories surrounding them as silent witnesses, Emma knew she had found what she had always been searching for, without knowing it. A home that wasn't a place but a person. A family that would grow and change but never abandon her. A love that had begun with lies and contracts but had transformed into the purest truth she would ever know. 5 years later, spring sunshine poured through Pages and Poetry's windows, illuminating the book spines with a golden gleam that seemed magical. In the children's reading corner, a 4-year-old girl with whiskey-colored eyes and dark brown hair listened fascinated as her mother read Charlotte's Web to her. It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer, Emma read, her soft voice resonating in the cozy space. Mummy, why did the spider have to— You know? Asked little Margaret, frowning with an intensity too reminiscent of her father. Why couldn't she just stay? Emma smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. Because sometimes, sweetheart, the most beautiful things teach us that nothing lasts forever. But what Charlotte gave Wilbur, her friendship, her love, that will always stay with him. Like Grandpa James with us. Exactly like Grandpa James with us. The door chime rang, and Alexander entered carrying a box of books freshly arrived from an auction in Boston. At 57, he had more grey hair and more wrinkles, but also more light in his eyes than Emma remembered from their first encounters. "Daddy!" Margaret jumped from her mother's lap, running toward him with extended arms. Alexander left the box on the counter just in time to catch her in the air, making her spin while she laughed with delight. "My little reader." He kissed her forehead. "What story are you reading today?" "Charlotte's Web. Mummy says it's about not forgetting the important people." Alexander exchanged a look with Emma over their daughter's head, one of those looks that contained entire conversations. "Your daughter is too perceptive for her age," he said. "Our daughter," Emma corrected with a smile. "And you know perfectly well who she inherited that from." The bookstore had flourished beyond any expectation. What began as an act of desperate salvation had become a New York cultural landmark. Established authors presented their works there. Literature students made pilgrimages to consult the James Richardson archives. And every Sunday, without fail, Emma organized a children's reading club where she planted in new generations the love for stories her father had transmitted to her. "Grandma Margaret called," said Alexander, setting his daughter on the floor. "She wants to know if we'll come for dinner on Sunday. Apparently the aunts have a surprise for someone." "For me?" asked little Margaret, jumping with excitement. "Possibly, though it could also be for Uncle Josh's baby." Emma stood, approaching her husband to steal a quick kiss. "Tell her we'll be there. I wouldn't miss a Hayes family gathering for anything in the world." The gatherings at the Connecticut estate had become sacred tradition. Margaret, the matriarch, presided over each encounter with the same energy she'd always had, now surrounded by grandchildren running through the gardens where once only silence grew. Catherine had had twins. Sarah had married a French artist, and together they'd adopted 2 children. Rebecca was expecting her 3rd child. And in the midst of all that glorious chaos, Emma had found the sense of belonging she never knew she was looking for. That night, after closing the bookstore and putting Margaret to bed with her obligatory story, Emma and Alexander sat on their Greenwich Village apartment balcony. They had sold the Connecticut estate 2 years ago, deciding they preferred a simpler life close to the business they loved. The money from the sale had gone to expand the bookstore and create a cultural foundation in James's memory. "What are you thinking about?" asked Alexander, noticing her contemplative expression. Emma looked toward the horizon where New York lights twinkled like fallen stars. "About how different everything is from what I imagined." She turned to him. "Do you remember our first night as a married couple? I was terrified, convinced I'd made the worst mistake of my life." "I remember. I was also more scared than you, though I hid it better. Look at me now." A smile curved her lips. "Mother of a girl who argues about literature at 4 years old. Wife of a man who still makes me laugh every day. Owner of a bookstore my father never could have dreamed of. Regret anything?" "Nothing." The answer was immediate, absolute. Every difficult moment, every fear, every tear, everything brought me here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Alexander took her hand, intertwining their fingers as he had done 1,000 times before. "You know what surprises me most about us?" "What?" "That we started with a contract and ended with a poem." His whiskey eyes shone with emotion. "Our story makes no sense on paper, but in the heart. In the heart, it's the most logical story there is." Emma leaned toward him, resting her head on his shoulder. "My father used to say the best books are those that change us without us realizing it, that we enter being one person and leave being another, better, more complete." "And what person were you before we met?" "Someone who read about love but didn't believe in it. Someone who hid between pages because the real world was too scary." She lifted her head to look at him. "You turned me into someone who lives the story instead of just reading it." "It wasn't me." Alexander kissed her forehead. "It was us, together." The silence that followed was one of those only shared by people who no longer need words to understand each other. 2 souls who had found their way home after years of wandering, who had built something beautiful on improbable foundations. In the distance, church bells from some church began to toll midnight. A new day began, full of unwritten possibilities, of blank pages waiting to be filled. "Ready for whatever comes?" asked Alexander. Emma smiled, that smile he had learned to recognize as the most genuine, the one she reserved only for moments of complete happiness. "Always, as long as it's with you." And so, On a balcony over New York under a star-speckled sky, two people who had begun as strangers in a contract ended as everything they always should have been: companions, lovers, friends. A family built not on convenience, but on the truth that had saved them both. Because in the end, as Emma had learned from her father and from the thousands of books that had formed her soul, the best stories aren't the ones that unfold without obstacles. The best stories are those where the protagonists choose to love each other despite everything, where the happy ending isn't a gift, but a conquest, where the last words aren't a closing, but a beginning. In the adjoining room, little Margaret slept, embracing her worn copy of Charlotte's Web, dreaming of spiders who wanted to be remembered, and words that changed lives. On the shelf beside her bed, all the books her mother would read to her in years to come waited, all the stories that would form her, as they had formed generations before her. And somewhere between the pages of all those books, in the margins and between lines, lived the spirit of James Richardson, smiling because his daughter had found exactly what he had always desired for her: a love that didn't give up, a family that embraced her, and enough words to fill an entire lifetime.